This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, Christof Koch is my guest. He's a neuroscientist, and we will be talking about consciousness, its nature, human and otherwise. As I usually like to do, I like to give my guests a few minutes to tell a little bit about themselves, their background, if they have any books or websites or anything else in regards to the subject matter. So first off, Christoph, thanks for appearing. And if you could just lay out a little bit of what drew you to the ideas or to the notion of what consciousness is. Is this something that was with you from childhood on, or what?
Well, first of all, to introduce myself, I'm Christof Koch. By training, I'm a physicist. I spent almost 3 decades as a professor at Caltech in Pasadena, professor of biology and engineering. And 5 years ago, I moved to Seattle, where I'm now the chief scientific officer and the president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science, which is a private, non-for-profit brain institute with roughly 300 scientists focusing on trying to understand cortex, neocortex, in both the mouse as well as the human brain. My interest in consciousness arose a long time ago. I grew up in a devout Roman Catholic family, but I was always wondering, like many of us, where does that voice inside my head come from, and where does everything I see and I hear, the movie of my life, it's dark inside my skull. I can assure you, if you do brain surgery, there's no light inside my gray matter, but here I am looking out at the world, and I have a movie inside my head. That's my life, and I hear voices and I smell things, and it's utterly unclear from physics or from chemistry, biology, how these sights and sounds come about. How is it? It's easy to explain, at least in principle, how I can get a thing to move or to act or to behave. But what's been very challenging, and this is of course the heart of the ancient mind-body problem, how do we feel anything? How is it that a piece of physical matter like my brain is capable of hearing, of seeing, of having pains and pleasures, of thinking, of remembering? That is the mystery. How do the feelings come about? How does experience come about? That's the heart of the mind-body problem. And if science is supposed to have a complete view and a complete understanding of the universe, and surely it must also be able to understand how consciousness comes into the world.
It's interesting that you said you classified yourself basically as a physicist, because in looking you up and reading about some of your background, most sites list you as a neuroscientist. So do you consider yourself now a physicist, or do you see no real distinction between neuroscience and physics?
Well, no, of course there is a distinction. I mean, practically what I do, of course, I'm a neuroscientist. I've published close to 300 books on neuroscience. Papers. I've read many books on neuroscience, but my background is physics, and the way I think about things is the way a physicist would think about things, which is slightly different than biologists. Biologists think about organisms and how they are shaped by evolution, by natural selection. And as physicists, I first think about how does matter come into being, and how does consciousness come into being, knowing, of course, that it comes into being in highly evolved systems. So it's the purview of a physicist, I would say, is somewhat larger than the purview of a biologist.
Now, this is the third of 3 shows that I've done speaking on this subject. I've spoken with a theologian and, a philosopher as well. So let me ask you a question, basically, where current neuroscience or science stands on the question of consciousness, and then ask for your more personal views, because I know you have some views that are interesting. What is the sort of current model of what consciousness is? Is it something that just comes from the physical meat of the mind and the interactions, the biological, chemical interactions? Is that what we would call, I guess, the standard model of consciousness now?
Yeah, well, it's always been among scientists. There's, among practicing scientists, consciousness is a product of the brain. we now know it's not the heart, as the ancient belief, and it's still anchored in our language. When I say I love you with all my heart, what you should really say, I love you with all my brain. And when you give your Valentine's a chocolate, it shouldn't be in the shape of a heart, it should be in the shape of a brain. So this has been the standard view for the past several hundred years. This is not particularly newsworthy now. Among philosophers, the vast majority of philosophers, and I would say the vast majority of scientists, we all believe it's a product of the brain. It's subject to natural physical laws like anything else in the universe. The mystery is how exactly it arises, and does it really exist, and what is it made out of, and how does it relate to the material world? That's sort of the question. And is it only that sort of adult humans or people who can speak about it, which of course doesn't include very young children or may not include very old people who are demented or who are aphasic? Is it common to all mammals? Is it common to all animals? Does it extend further? Those are the sort of question. Experimentally, what people are concerned with a much more pragmatic question, like what bits and pieces of the brain actually give rise to consciousness. We know from the last several hundred years of clinical neurology that you can have damage, you can lose certain parts of your brain and your consciousness isn't affected. You can lose other very small parts of your brain and you may be in a profound state of unconsciousness, you may be in a persistent vegetative state. So practically what people worry about, what specific bits and pieces of the brain and what specific mechanism give rise to consciousness. And this is called, this search is called looking for the neuronal correlates of consciousness, or also abbreviated as NCC, the neuronal correlates of consciousness. Which specific mechanism in which specific parts of the brain give rise to sensation of pain, of pleasure, of hearing, of seeing. That's what experimentally consumes the time of people who work on this subject.
Now, when I was a young man, one of the books that I read was Daniel Dennett's a book about consciousness, where he put forth what was called the theory of multiple drafts, that the brain is so inundated with sensory information that in the complexity of trying to sort through this, consciousness is sort of epiphenomenal, and it's not, in a sense, there's no you in you. It's sort of maybe you could say a synergy that arises out of it, or an epiphenomenon. And now that, from what I've read, just as a layman, that seems to not be where most research is. That there have been people, and I've looked at you spoke on this too, that you think that the consciousness might be fundamental in some elemental way in matter or in the fabric of the cosmos itself. Am I correct in saying that you've taken that position at times?
Wait, so first of all, so I just spent the last 10 days on a cruise with Dan Dennett, and he still very much holds that view that fundamentally people are sort of confused about it. There isn't really, when you come down to the bottom of it, there really isn't anything there. The consciousness doesn't really exist. It's, as you said, then it's sort of it's an epiphenomenon. We're confused about it. We have actions, we have behaviors, but there isn't anything special about. There isn't really the experience that people talk about. He used the term there to reify. Right? We reify. We distill consciousness, we make it out to be this special thing, but if you really look very hard, there isn't anything. All there is a body and a disposition to move or to act or to behave in certain ways. I don't think that explains anything. It doesn't explain this central fact, which really goes back to the most famous deduction in Western thought is, René Descartes, 17th century, cogito ergo sum, je pense donc je suis. In modern language, we would say, I'm conscious, therefore I am. The only certainty I have is that I exist because I have conscious states. I am conscious. And so I know I exist. I only know I exist because I'm conscious. Physics comes afterwards. The knowledge about other people and other minds and stars and dogs and elements and electrons and Higgs bosons and all of that comes afterward. That's all inferential. It's a very good inference, but it's inferential. The only thing I have direct acquaintance is my direct conscious experience of the world.
Yeah.
So I have to explain this. And the question is, how do I explain it? Yes, and I tend to have a view there's a particular theory of consciousness. That's a quantitative mathematical theory of consciousness called integrated information theory of consciousness that essentially says consciousness has something to do with particular type of highly integrated and differentiated information. And any physical system, any mechanism, if you want, in a particular state where these neurons are on or those neurons are off, or those transistors are on and those transistors are off, is in principle capable of having integrated information. Therefore, it would feel like something to be this mechanism in this particular state. So that says that consciousness may be much more widespread than we believe it. And of course, there's this ancient belief that's prevalent in many cultures, particularly in the East, but you can also find predecessor here in Western thought called panpsychism that also asserts that consciousness is much more widespread than we think it is.
So just sort of extrapolating from that, I would take it that you are someone who thinks that artificial intelligence is certainly a possibility, if not a likelihood, whether it takes 50 or 100 years or something, that there's no, that some people who would say that you know, machineries or neural networks that are artificially constructed couldn't be conscious. That, from what you just said, that would not be so. You would if it acts conscious, it feels conscious. You know, if it quacks like a duck, then you know an android or a robot or whatever you would call it, we'd have to say that is consciousness, even if it was something, say, just like a computer system, like HAL the computer from 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Well, yes and no. It's a very complicated question. Yes, in the sense that there's nothing magical about consciousness, that in principle any physical system that has highly integrated, differentiated information, that it feels like something to be that system, i.e. that it is conscious. B, it depends on the exact system and its exact internal circuitry. And by some measures, a digital von Neumann machine running sort of a Turing-like paradigm may have very little consciousness. In order to get human-level consciousness, which is sort of what most of us are interested in, sort of, this bright consciousness that we have, including self-consciousness, being able to reflect upon yourself, etc., that might require the causal powers of the brain that you cannot simulate. You have to actually build. You can't get consciousness out of pure computation. This is what the theory said. It's very clear on its implication. You actually have to build it. You have to build a physical mechanism that sort of emulates something like the brain in all of its messy details in order to get human-level consciousness. So no, just because you have an android that behaves like a human doesn't mean at all that it has human-level consciousness.
But
there's a good metaphor, even better, there's a good analogy. If you take, for example, if you implement Einstein's law of general relativity, and you simulate on a computer the black hole at the center of our galaxy, right, which weighs roughly 1 million solar masses. Of course, famously, we know, and the simulation bear this out, that no light can escape from this black hole, right? It's, by definition, it's invisible. Yet, the space-time outside the computer itself is not twisted, right? So if you run this on a big supercomputer at a university supercomputer center, the supercomputer itself isn't sucked into the black hole.
Yeah.
It simulates a black hole, but it doesn't possess the causal powers of a black hole.
Yeah.
Same thing, you can simulate behavior associated with consciousness, but that's very different from actually being conscious.
Right, and that
distinction.
And that gets to the more current notion of the last decade or so, what I've heard called embodiment theory, that in order to get a human sort of consciousness, even in an artificial construct, you would have to have an android or something that looks human, that is quadrupedal, that has the sensory senses that we do, that would be bipedal and whatnot. Because the only way you can really experience what it's seemingly like to be human is to be human-like, rather than just being a computer that's in a stationary place and just fed information.
Yeah, but I have to emphasize, it's also actually the computer itself cannot just be can't just be sort of a Turing von Neumann machine.
Yeah.
The computer, so you have to build something what's called a neuromorphic computer. So, for example, IBM has an architecture called True North, where they're trying to build something called neuromorphic that has synapses and neurons, etc. And your brain, the brain of this embodied android, would also have to have some of the causal powers of the human brain rather than a very general purpose digital computer. Have you seen the movie Ex Machina?
I haven't seen it, but I've had people who've seen it. Yeah, I know the general outline.
So I would warmly recommend it, because that is all around the question, of course, is Eva. That's what the female protagonist, and they're always female. And the male protagonists are guys that fall in love. So it's a Turing test, but it's a lust test, really.
Yeah.
Rather than a Turing test. And there, at some point, we are being shown sort of the brain of Ava. You know, the movie doesn't really go into details what it is, but it suggests it's some sort of bioorganic living computer, and that comes much closer to capturing some of the causal power, at least in this fictitious context of the movie, of capturing the causal power of the human brain.
Well, you just mentioned the Turing test, and there's also things like the mirror test for animals and whatnot. Are those kinds of tests, though, fundamentally limited? I mean, could we, for example, there's the phrase "life as we know it" or "life as we don't know it." Could there be consciousness in ways that we don't particularly recognize simply because of our own limits of consciousness?
Yeah, of course. So the question is, does the simple organism like a fly? Okay, so in biology, people study the fly, the fruit fly, right? It has 100,000 neurons. It's this tiny thing called the fruit fly, okay? The billions of them, trillions of them around. And the question is, does it feel like something to be a fly? Now, most people, certainly in Western culture, in monotheistic culture, would completely deny that, right? The idea is that flies, you know, just like any other bugs, you know, just like worms, you know, they're just simple robots, they're just simple reflexes, right? Now, of course, we now know that they are actually quite complicated, that they're amazingly complicated, that some of the neural mechanisms that a fly has parallels the neural mechanisms that mammals like us have, albeit much simpler. And then, so therefore, it may well be that it feels like something to be a fly. Now, obviously, a fly it may not feel like a lot. It doesn't have self-consciousness. There really isn't any evidence of episodic memory, etc. But the fly, of course, like any other biological organism, has memory. It can be conditioned. It can be fear conditioned, just like a dog or a human can be fear conditioned. So we don't recognize it because it doesn't talk and it's tiny, but that doesn't mean that it may not feel like something. It doesn't mean that it may not have some measure of experience of the world.
Yeah.
So an empirical question, Dan, is how do you test that?
Yeah.
So you ultimately you need a theory, a fundamental theory that tells you which systems are capable of experiencing, and then practically, how do you actually test this in a practical experimental context to assess to what extent other animals, particular sort of non-mammals, I mean, we're willing to give our conscience to our cats and dogs and monkeys, but the farther away we go, you know, on the evolutionary tree, the less likely people will accord consciousness to these other creatures, which I think is a capital mistake.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about, since it's, I think, fundamental in what you were talking about, what it's like to be a fly. There's the idea of what's called quails or qualia, what I would recognize as the color red, what I might recognize as the sense, the taste of bitterness. Is that the same red? Is that the same bitterness that you would experience? And does it really matter if the cognates of the words that we're using to describe whatever sensations we're feeling somehow match up? Is there any way, for example, that we can test that two human brains or two consciousnesses actually see red at a red stop sign and it's the same color in both of their minds now? Because I've seen, like, Google, I think, was doing something where they're taking brain images. If, like, you flash Marilyn Monroe's photograph in front of someone, and you can see a sort of a blurry image of what looks to be a blonde woman's face, but not quite detailed. is there any way that, say, in the next 15 or 20 years, you think that we'll be able to actually say, well, yes, my red is just like Christof's red?
Well, so it depends. It depends what you mean by just like. We all have slightly different cone distributions. There are two alleles of the long wavelength photoreceptor gene. So, and it's roughly 48% and 52% of men have slightly different ones. You know, the exact distribution of the red, green, and blue photoreceptors differs in your brain and in my brain.
Yeah.
My early visual experience is not going to be exactly the same as yours. Right? So, in the very particular details, it does matter. But overall, we know from behavior and we know from neuroscience it activates similar receptors, it activates similar brain mechanisms in you and I. So, you know, it's one of these questions. You know, will I ever exactly know what you're thinking? No, but using brain scans and other advanced sort of imaging technologies, I can more and more infer that what you see is similar to what I see. Maybe not identical, because to be identical, we really have to have the same brain and the same exact visual experience, which of course we'll never have, even though if we're identical twins. But for most purposes, what we see is very similar. Now, I can't prove that logically. Yes, philosophers have these endless, you know, thought experiments. You know, if I switch every red neuron against the blue neurons and everything else is alike, yes, in principle, I may not be able to say that. In fact, in principle, you may be a zombie. In fact, everybody else, in principle, logically, it's fully compatible with what I know about the universe, that everything else is a zombie and I'm the only conscious being in the universe. But you know, but from a biological point of view, or physical point of view, that is so extremely unlikely that I'm not going to worry about it.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask about the concept of philosophical zombies, but I'll let that go. But on a tangent, I had mentioned earlier artificial intelligence, and I wanted to talk about the idea of memory, because in the last quarter century or so, there have been a number of people, most famously Ray Kurzweil, who talks about artificial intelligence and this thing he calls the singularity, where artificial and human consciousness will either merge, and so we won't have a robopocalypse, as a lot of sci-fi fans talk about, but that humans and biological or non-biological entities will become sort of a cyborg kind of race. But I'm wondering, though, the idea of uploading someone's memory into something, to me, a fellow named Mark Rowlands, a philosopher, had what he called the river of cells, that, you know, as every neuron, or not every atom in our body is replaced over the course of several years, what remains is the pattern. And if we were to say upload your consciousness, your memories, everything into a computer, well, that wouldn't be Christof. I mean, that would be Christof 2.0 perhaps, and maybe that's an interesting thing. But you yourself, that would not be you continuously. You could, you know, there would be a break in your consciousness. So, what is your view on some of these ideas that a lot of, like, what I would call utopianists maybe have of you know, humanity becoming conscious through some kind of cyber life?
Well, I have continuously breaks in my consciousness. Okay, you know, I slept, right, over the last 6 hours. You know, last night I slept for 6 hours. Well, I wasn't conscious, and then I woke up. Right? Am I exactly the same as the person who went to bed? Well, technically, my brain is slightly different. Do I detect it? No, I don't seem to detect any difference between Christof at 6 a.m. this morning and Christof at 10 p.m. last night. But technically, you know, it's not the same. So, in principle, if you replicate my brain exactly in a different mechanism and you give it the same causal power, de facto it'll be the same consciousness. Whether logically it's identical or not, I think that's a different matter. I don't think that's terribly relevant. With respect to the singularity, I'm very skeptical. We've talked, you know, Ray Kurzweil has talked about this for the past 25 years, always sort of postulating it safely 10 years into the future. Now it's receded again. We all know progress is much slower than we like to believe. In terms, for example, of brain-machine interfaces, it's taken much longer, because interfacing anything with the human brain is very difficult. it's dangerous every time you put something into the human brain. Every time you compromise the integrity of the skull, there's infection, etc., going on. Yes, we can now put certain devices into our brains, but it's done in people who have who have a diagnostic reasons for it, who are paralyzed or otherwise seriously incapacitated. And if you follow a lot of those patients, very often they get de-implanted after several months because it turns out it's actually not very practical. So yes, sometimes in the distant future, all those wonderful things may happen, but certainly not within our lifetime. Yes, and once again, in principle, it's possible to replicate my consciousness in a different mechanism. The question is that going to happen anytime soon? And that I'm extremely skeptical.
I wanted to ask about something that I think rarely gets spoken of in ideas of consciousness or talks about consciousness, and that's the idea of intuition, especially as it relates to creativity. John Keats, an English poet, had come up with a term called negative capability, which basically has several meanings, but the most relevant one is basically that a great artist, a writer, a musician can make sort of leaps of illogic that seem illogical at first, but then in recollection, people go, ah, that makes sense. Um, is there a difference in the way that the minds or the brains of, say, a great poet or a great composer or a great filmmaker operates versus, say, someone who's a welder or a banker or a secretary? Is there something just physically in the construct of what we know of how their brains work, or are the brains that just one way, and it's just that the brains have somehow been wired by the experiences they had early on in childhood, perhaps?
Well, I mean, so you're talking about the psychology of creativity. So let me point out, each brain is really different because we pound by pound, the human brain is by far the most complex organ in the known universe. Okay, vastly outnumbering any other system, and there's basically an infinite number of possible brains that you could generate. Each one is unique. So in that sense, we're all unique. A welder is as unique, the brain of a welder, or of a secretary, or of a world-class composer. They're all different. What a highly creative person maybe has different from somebody who's less creative is the fact that the inner sensor in her brain may be less active and may continuously each one of us continuously comes up with all sorts of crazy ideas. Most of the time, those crazy ideas are immediately vetoed, either consciously or unconsciously. Now, somebody who's very creative, she may be much better at not sort of constantly shooting down all those ideas, but actually trying to see whether they can actually be implemented in her preferred medium, whether that's paint or art or music or science. So it's more, if you look at the highly creative people. So I've been around some of the smartest scientists, and the difference is they're much more likely to voice a whole lot of ideas. Many of these ideas are truly crazy or wacky or obviously wrong if you just think about them, but they somehow seem to have less problems just thinking about these, in the privacy of the head, or at least in conversations, than other people who immediately say, "Oh no, that's a crazy idea. I'm not going to say that because I don't want to embarrass myself." So I think that's a big difference in terms of coming up with all of our brains continuously come up with ill-justified or strange or bizarre ideas, but some people are better at taking those and then actually seeing that they actually can be mapped onto something out there, and we call that a creative act. Because we don't understand, because for the most part it involves mechanisms in the brain that we don't have conscious access to. And so therefore to us, subjectively, it seems like, oh, suddenly this idea popped into my head, I have no idea from where it came. It did come from your brain, but it came from unconscious parts of your brain that are continuously sort of working there silently outside the limelight of consciousness.
Well, there's a couple of things on that I want to talk about too. And it has to do with perception and conscious perception of things, because, like you had mentioned earlier, we, cogito ergo sum, I am because I think, and everything that we know about the cosmos comes from our sensory perceptions. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions about perception. The first is the term called synesthesia, that there are some people, for example, who, if they hear a beautiful song, they may their eyes, they may see the color pink or the color yellow or something, or someone may be watching or reading a book, and they may get a smell that's very sweet and pleasant to them. Some people have positive that I've read that this is just some miswiring in the brain, but other people I've read that there have been some actual tests done of some brains, and actually I think there are certain types. Some women can sometimes see more colors than whatever the 64 or whatever amount of colors that most people can see. What do you have you ever studied synesthesia, and could you maybe expound on some of these things?
Okay, well, so you're talking about two different phenomena. One is the phenomena that some women may have. So early on in our conversation, I mentioned the fact that there are two different types of genes that encode for the long wavelength photopigment, the red one. Let's just call it R1 and R2. And men either have one or the other, and they are slightly different. They are slightly shifted in their spectral sensitivity. Now, some women turned out have both of them simultaneously expressed in their retina. So they have the conventional, they have the short, the medium, and two of these long wavelengths photoreceptor pigments. So in other words, they can sort of they can distinguish colors that normal. And they're called tetrachromat. So most of us are trichromat. Most of us have three colors. In other words, we can match any kind of colors in the world with the three primary colors.
Yeah.
Some men, 7% of all men, are dichromat, right? They're so-called colorblind, and every color for them can be matched by two lights. And the way to test them, I can show you, for example, it's a test called Nishihara color plate test, where I show you numbers that for dichromat, for you, if you're a normal color-sided individual, you immediately can see there are sort of numbers embedded in these pictures. But a colorblind person doesn't see that. For a colorblind person, certain colors he can't distinguish. So there are these women that have superior color vision. So for most of us, for all guys, and most of women who have just three photoreceptor pigments, they can't tell these colors apart. But these women they have sort of super resolution. They can see distinction where other people can't. So that's one phenomenon. The other phenomenon that you alluded to is called synesthesia. Most of the time, it also involves colors, and so I had somebody in my lab, grad students, because you tend to find these synesthetes at a higher percentage level than in the general population. You find them in college-educated kids. And this person, which is quite common, sees numbers are colored. So whenever he writes down a number or he thinks of a number, they are sort of they have colors. And what's very typical again, they remember, as far as they remember back to childhood, they always have this phenomena, and it's always the same colors associated with the same number. So 5 is always red, and 6 might be pink, and 7 is blue. It's not that this changes day to day. And people have done imaging experiments, in fact, and you get also the part of the brain are active that you expect to be active when you see a colored stimulus, even though you may show them a word or number that doesn't have a color, but they see a color, and lo and behold, the color part of their brain lights up. So the best interpretation we have, again, you mentioned this, Dan, is the one that it's miswiring, that very early on, maybe in utero already, there's some wiring between, or later on, early on in childhood, when people learned about numbers and words, there was this miswiring between the brain area that codes for numbers or for words, and the brain area that codes for colors. It's very constant. They have it for the rest of their life, and most of the people tend to enjoy it. Most of the time, synesthetes, they really appreciate this additional sense, or this combination between the two senses that most of us normals don't have unless we take LSD or mescaline.
Well, let me ask something a little bit more speculative, because if we had had this conversation, say 25, 30 years ago about synesthesia, a lot of people would have been a lot more scoffing about it. If we sort of project out to, say, the middle of this century, do you think that there's any possibility that some of the claims that people make for various types of extrasensory perception could turn out to be true, i.e., that people could have an ability to remote view and see something, say, around the corner and 100 yards away, or could maybe be able to look inside a lead-lined safe and see what was put in that safe, or perhaps even the most extreme example, some people claiming that they didn't get on an airplane because they knew it was going to crash and then it crashed. I always sort of relegate that kind of thing is that we always get these kinds of sensations and feelings that if I walk around that next corner, a mugger is going to get me. But 99 times out of 100, the mugger isn't there. The one time that mugger might be there and hits me, that's going to stick in my mind more than the 99 other misses. So do you think that there's anything possible that by, in the coming decades, that extrasensory perceptions or some types of it, even minimally, might prove scientifically valid?
I think you've given the best possible explanation for it. I'm very skeptical. I don't think we can violate, nothing can violate the iron law of causality. So if it's, if it's in the future, I simply don't have access to it. That would be a fundamental. That would require a fundamental revision of everything we know about physics and about science. So I'm extremely skeptical. Logically, of course, it's plausible. The evidence for that would have to be overwhelmingly compelling.
And probably the most, I guess, extreme example of what I would consider in that vein of people who believe in somehow reincarnation. And I mean, I'm not religious or whatnot, but even there are some people who are not religious who believe that there's some kind of reincarnation, be it of the soul or whatever the conscious thing is. So you would then, I guess, subscribe to the idea that just as Christof Koch was built up over the years to become the entity, the thinking entity that he is, when you take your last breath and your body starts to decay, that's it. Then there's no consciousness beyond death in your worldview.
No brain, never mind.
that's a that's a good one.
I mean, I wish it. Listen, I grew up, as I said, as a devout Roman Catholic. I grew up in the existence, the belief of a soul. I wish there would be a soul, because I don't like to die, like any other organism. I like to live forever. But you just have, science is a tale for grown-up. It's not a story for children. It's not a consoling story for children, but a tale for grown-up men. And as far as we know, and this is our scientific worldview tells us we need a mechanism for our mind. So either a brain or maybe, in the future, a computer that uploads my brain. But without such a mechanism, there is no possibility of mind. I spent a couple of years ago a week with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and in fact I'll do it again in December of this year, and we had this debate about Western science and Buddhist approaches to mind and body. And it was remarkable the agreement we had between our mutual views, between the scientific sort of objective view of the mind body and the sort of the Buddhist view, exploring it by meditation and other techniques from the inside. But the one point where we fundamentally differ is in reincarnation. And once again, no brain, never mind. Without some mechanism, there cannot be. I mean, if you, where's your soul? Where are the memory of the soul? Going to reside, right? In the cloud, it needs to be somewhere, and that's unfortunately the story that science tells us. Now, I can choose not to believe it. I can say, well, I really want to believe in life after death, and so therefore I'm going to willfully ignore the evidence of science, which is what most people do because they're not comfortable with the idea of death. But once you're grown up, you say, yes, that's what life is.
Yeah, the thing, and I've spoken with some theologians on this interview series and elsewise, and I don't know if it's necessarily the fear of death as much as it's the fear of dying, because I've often said to people, what is there to fear about death? I wasn't around in 1853. I'm not going to be around in 2153. So if I don't have any memories or sensations of pain or anger or rage or disappointment if I try to project myself backwards, I have this small little frame of maybe 70, 80, 90, 100 years if I'm lucky to live in, and that's it. So I don't know if I've never really particularly understood that myself. Um,
Well, I mean, I remember as a child, the one thing that would absolutely terrify, I had a very good positive childhood, but the one thing that would absolutely terrify me was lying in bed at night and thinking about infinity. Really infinity, forever and ever and ever and ever, right? And you realize at some point early on, okay, at some point you're going to be dead, and then forever, ever, ever, there will never be anything else.
yeah.
And our mind just balks at that, and it's truly a terrifying notion. It's what Pascal wrote about the terror of the empty spaces, and so I understand that existentialist terror, but once again, at some point, you have to accept that if you really want to, have a rational view of the life and try to have an objective view of possible of life, then you realize that this life is all you have. This 70, 80, 90, or 100 years, as you said, if we're lucky, that's all we have. That's just the reality.
Yeah, now I wanted to again get back on perception, but go in a different arc than say extrasensory perception here. And that's we talked about artificial intelligence, and in the last couple of years, especially with some of our spacecraft getting going around some of the moons of Jupiter, which we think have water. We know Pluto now has water. We think Mars has had water. Some of the asteroids, and we can sort of project out that humanity in the next couple of 100 years will probably colonize the rest of the solar system and move out. Eventually, we will find either uh, chemical signatures of life when we look at exoplanets or whatnot. So let me ask you about to get speculative in a different way than ESP and talk about possible alien consciousnesses and perhaps alien intelligences, because I guess we could say sentience or intelligence is a little bit more than consciousness. There have been you said you are a physicist, and one of the major problems in physics of the last few decades has been the idea of dark matter and dark energy being this thing that people have posited makes up the mass of the universe because certain mathematical equations regarding gravity don't hold up in the spin of galaxies and other things. Could it be perhaps that uh, that the limits of our own perception are behind some of the things that we don't fully understand, i.e., that an alien species or an intelligent species that had some other kind of consciousness based on other senses that evolved could look at the same problems we're looking at and say, what, we don't see any problem. Could, for example, I've often asked, is our idea of mathematics, for example, the real world? Or is that just the language that we use to describe reality? And could, say, an alien intelligent species have a totally different form of what we would call mathematics that fully explains the universe, do you think?
Yes, it's quite likely. I mean, we are limited by our cognitive apparatus, right? If you're a dog, I love dogs, right? And a dog is clearly a conscious entity. It can have pain or pleasure. It can be very excited, very happy. But clearly, a dog doesn't know about taxes or about real estate or about the stock market or about democracy, right? And even a very smart dog simply is incapable of thinking about these things, right? So yes, we may, there might be in other parts of the universe highly evolved. Much more evolved creatures, right? That's been around for a billion years, let's say, or not just several millions like Homo sapiens, that have vastly more insight into the nature of reality than. I mean, I don't think there's anything magical about us. We build up laboriously this view of the universe, over the last, but that's only over the last 300 years, right? If you go back in any other point over the last 8,000 years of history, we had very impoverished views of the universe, and it's only now with the development of infrared and now we realize there are gravitational waves around, right? So even with no baryonic matter in the universe, we can still have these ways of communicating, in principle, using gravitational wave, and I'm sure there are going to be many big surprises in store for us. But one thing I wanted to, because you several times made this statement that we really have to sharply distinguish between intelligence and consciousness, and this is only a phenomena of the last several decades. over the last, since essentially forever, certainly since recorded history, intelligence and consciousness were always the same. When you got a human, assuming a normal human, not brain damage, etc., you got a reasonable intelligent person, and this person was also consciousness. But now, of course, we can separate, at least in principle, you can think about a two-dimensional graph. When one axis you plot consciousness, the amount of consciousness, on the other axis you plot intelligence. And it's certainly possible if you look at, for example, smart cars. You look at AlphaGo, the recent recent program by DeepMind that beat Lee Sedol at Go. You look at Deep Blue. You look at Watson. In all those cases, you got systems that are intelligent, at least in a narrow sense.
Yeah.
In fact, that can beat humans in chess, in Jeopardy, in Go. Yet as far as we can tell, there's no evidence for any consciousness. So we have to realize that, particularly now with the rise of deep machine learning and other AI techniques, that we might get intelligence, in fact, even high intelligence, possibly even super intelligence, in other words, more intelligent than any living human, without having consciousness. So we have to be very careful. Are we talking about consciousness?
Yeah.
We're talking about intelligence, and not the same thing.
Well, because clearly, for example, we could go in the other direction, that there would certainly be consciousness without intelligence. If we look at, say, single-celled organisms, an amoeba that surrounds, say, a paramecium that it wants to devour, isn't saying, "Oh, there's a paramecium, I'm hungry." It's doing it's stimulated by maybe the ripples in the water that the paramecium makes. It maybe senses some chemical smell or some movement, and it starts to surround it. So it's basically just a chemical or biological reaction that's rote. That. So I mean, the amoeba itself wouldn't have consciousness then.
So in principle, yes, you can have very simple organisms where, at least according to this one theory mentioned earlier on, integrated information theory of consciousness, it might feel like something to be this very simple creature, yet there is no intelligence, at least no recognizable intelligence, no intelligence that we would recognize as such. Yeah. So in principle, you can formulate this two-dimensional plane with these axes of intelligence and consciousness, with different entities that have high intelligence and high consciousness, high intelligence without consciousness, high consciousness with no intelligence, and no intelligence and no consciousness.
Let me ask another question, though, because one of the a science fiction trope that's been around for many decades is sort of the idea of there being consciousness without a corporeal being, and this is different from like life after death. Imagine, for example, if we found, for example, out in the cosmos now clouds that are made of alcohol, interstellar clouds of alcohol or other organic matter. Do you think, how many alternate ways, say, other than, say, brain wiring, do you think consciousness might arise? Could there, for example, be a conscious interstellar cloud of organic molecules that for billions of years has been floating between galaxies somehow, that could, in some bizarre way, be conscious in some form, even if we don't recognize it?
Yeah, of course, there's a classic novel by the astronomer Fred Hoyle called The Black Cloud.
Yeah.
Which is exactly that, right? It's this cloud that comes into the solar system of some semi-organic molecules, and that shows intelligence and sentience and communicates. This was written in the early 1950s. Yes, in principle, life and consciousness can be found in many guises. For instance, think about a planet, a planet without a star, right? We now know there are probably as many planets that don't have any stellar companion, wandering around the intergalactic space, as there are planets around stars. Now, it's going to be so cold on those planets, essentially background, 3 degrees Kelvin. At those temperatures, you would get superconductivity. Right? So it may well be that if you have one of those planets covered by an ocean of superconductive helium, where of course electricity can circulate forever, that you get very complicated forms of life, based on this, on this mechanism, including consciousness. You would get, evolution by natural selection going in such a strange ocean. Yeah, so I'm sure we'll discover life at the bottom of, methane, on the bottom of, the water underneath the moon Europa. We'll find life in very strange places, and then of course we'll also find consciousness in very strange places that are very different from the life you and I grew up to. But even on this planet, right? If you go to some of those smoker stacks,
Yeah.
At the bottom of the ocean, that looks pretty weird to us. And this is life that's totally independent of photosynthesis, right? It uses hydrogen sulfide to power itself. It doesn't depend at all on the sun. Even if the sun becomes extinguished, this life would go on. So there's strange life everywhere. And if the life is complex enough, it will feel like something to be this life. So I've no doubt in the future we'll discover some very strange entities with very different consciousness than you and I have.
Yeah, I've actually read some people who have estimated that the biomass of life under the earth, under the soil, is actually more than that above it.
Yeah. And then the question is that all single cell microbes and bacteria, which is what most people believe, or is there actually complex life? That has motility and that has something like a central nervous system. And so far, the evidence seems to suggest it's sort of mainly microbial life.
Well, it also brings up the idea of people call superorganisms, like that an ant colony may be made up of individuals that we would say are alive, but the superorganism of the ant colonies that was started by one of the queen ants, or you could say a wasp or a bee, that these things act in ways that have far greater intelligence than any of the individual ants have themselves.
Yes. So just look at the best known superorganism called the United States of America, right? Right, so there's this organism that consists of 310 million individuals that acts on the world stage. It goes around and makes pronouncements and bombs other countries and sends warships and etc. etc. And so clearly this superorganism has lots of causal power. However, there's no evidence to suggest, there's no scientific credible evidence to suggest that this superorganism by itself is conscious. In other words, it doesn't feel like anything to be United States. It feels like something to be a citizen of the United States. So both you and I are citizens, and both you and I, are clearly conscious, but there isn't any conscious entity above it for very interesting reasons. So same thing, I think, with the anthill. The question is there consciousness associated with the ants? I do believe as a biologist, yes, but that's different from the question is there consciousness associated with the superorganism? Now you can look at the analogy of the brain. So the question is, is each of my brain cell as an individual conscious, or is the brain as a whole conscious? So in principle, once again, you want a theory that tells you the granularity of consciousness. What are the entities that are conscious, and what are the entities that are that make up that larger entity that may not be conscious? So conscious clearly is assigned to a particular scale.
Yeah.
As I said, it's not associated with the country as a whole. We have no evidence to suggest that it's associated with individual neurons in my brain that may be different in a single cell organism. So in each case, it seems to be associated with this particular type of spatial temporal scale. And you want a theory that explains that.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the idea of a superorganism when you were talking about microbes below the surface of the Earth. And also, too, you had mentioned like an ocean. Obviously, like Solaris by Stanislav Lem is probably the most famous example of that, the novel that was made into a film by Andrei Tarkovsky. And then also, too, I've even read people speculate that super dense neutron stars, and even some things that people who don't believe, say, in black holes, that have posited things called gravitars, that you could actually have perhaps some kind of consciousness emerge in that. So you might have even, in a sense, like a sentient celestial object. But I just want to ask a couple of other questions before.
Well, in each case, Dan, you have to think. So in the super dense neutron star, you particularly if you're talking about a complex consciousness like you and I, there lots of different states. If the super dense neutron star can only be in one state, as we believe there is the case in black holes, then you're not going to get consciousness.
No.
You want many, I can see, I mean, if you think about every frame of every movie I've ever seen or will ever see, each one is a distinct conscious state associated with it, right? And then all the things I've smelled, all the taste I've ever tasted in my life, etc. So all of that needs a very complex substrate. So if in the neutron star you can only get one state or two states, then you're not going to get a very sophisticated consciousness. So that's always a question you have to ask, whatever mechanism you postulate, whether it's a sea of liquid, an ocean of liquid helium, or a superdense neutron star, or a black cloud, or a human brain.
So basically then complexity, you would say, is very essential to the creation of consciousness.
Well, totally, because each conscious state has to have its own substrate, right?
Yeah.
Right now, if you're talking to me, every time I think about something, my brain is in a slightly different state. Only slightly, but different enough for me to recall my grandmother or my dog that's passed away, right? And so, yes, you need high complexity in order to get a very complex consciousness.
I just had a couple of other questions that I just wanted to touch on, since they're generally always associated, and then we can wrap up the interview. Another thing that's always posited along with consciousness is the idea of free will, and this really isn't a science. I don't really know if this would even be considered a scientific debate as much as a philosophical debate. I personally, when we talk about complexity, I think the universe is so goddamn complex that the idea that anything could be predeterminism, that determinism on anything other than a small level, is to me just untenable. And this could be either your personal viewpoint or something that maybe you've studied or whatnot. What is your take on the ideas of consciousness and free will as might exist?
Well, I've written quite a bit about it. Well, so first of all, you can't escape the iron laws of physics, right? Whether the universe is complex or not. So the laws, so classical physics, of course, is fully deterministic. Now, quantum mechanics, we know that the world is at its heart indeterministic. In other words, there are certain things. It's just the way it's not the limitation of my eyes or my sensory apparatus. It's not our limits of our meters, of our instruments, but it's just fundamentally part of the universe. But that's, of course, not what people mean by free will, right? They don't want sort of this random choice, this indeterminism. They want free will. Now that's much more complicated. So as a physicist, I know I live in a universe where, as I said, the ironclad laws of physics rule. On the other hand, as from a psychological, phenomenological point of view, I behave as if I'm free. So Immanuel Kant, if you read his critique of pure reason or his critique of applied reason, essentially says, we know we live in a determinate universe, but we have to behave, and we do behave as if we are free. The interesting question is, to what extent, if you have we know this, even if you look at very simple organisms like a fly. So people have done these experiments. You put a fly into a little maze. People actually do this experiment where they put flies into mazes, and you come to a branch point, and you ask, what do they do? Well, even as simple as organism as a fly, some will go to the left, some will go to the right, some will stay put, and because they're confused, they don't know what to do. Some will go back, right? And you put the same fly into the same circumstance again, and the fly will do something different. So clearly, even such a simple organism as a fly is enormously more complex than, let's say, a simple physical system, but it is much simpler than a human brain. Already that you cannot predict in any meaningful sense what a fly will do, let alone what a human will do. So certainly from an external point of view, you can't predict people in any one specific instance.
Well, one of the things that I've often argued with people about is that I think it comes down to people have this dualistic or binary view of the universe, that there's either left or right, up or down, black or white, 0, 1. But, if we're walking down a street together, there's maybe several dozen different things that we could do. We could take our next step. I could stop and sneeze. You could look at a pretty girl walking across the street. There would be literally, dozens of things that could happen in the next second. And then in the next second after that, each of those would, so within a matter of a few seconds, there would be literally, millions, if not billions or trillions of possible ways that we could go. That to me, that's one of the things when you talk about complexity, that determinism in the face of the complexity of even just, a small thing like what's going on in my house as I'm interviewing you, to me just seems untenable. And again, I'm a layman, but I just
yeah, but that's still yeah, no, I agree. I totally agree with you. But that's so. We have to distinguish a question also with the fly before. Can I practically predict what a fly will do, or let alone what a human will do? And of course, I can't. Although in large numbers, I can start predicting how people will vote and, what the outcome is based on their social economic status, where they end up in life, etc. So there's some certain type of predictability. But that still doesn't, of course, answer the question: are you really free or not? Yes, I can predict you, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you have complete freedom. Now, there's some interesting neuroscience that relates to this, which is we now know there are parts of the brain that get activated that actively generated in the quality of feeling free. So right now, for example, I'm just raising my right hand here, right? You can see it, right?
Yeah.
I feel I'm perfectly free to raise my right hand. I have this feeling it's free. Right? So I freely initiated this feeling. Now, and what you can do, you can, for example, take a device called the transcranial magnetic stimulator, put it up above my head here on the left side, and zap my brain, and then my hand will twitch. I get what's called ownership. I have the feeling it's my hand. So clearly I know it's my hand, but I don't have this feeling of intentionality. I don't get this feeling, I wanted my hand to move. Rather, I get this feeling, interesting, my hand just moved.
Yeah.
And so we know now that there are specific mechanisms, just like we know there are mechanisms that if I stimulate them, give rise to the sense of seeing color or seeing motion, we now know there's a part of the brain that generates this feeling, I just decided to move my hand. So there's the bottom line is there's a specific psychologically feeling that's generated by a particular part of the brain that gives rise to this feeling of freedom. Whether or not I'm free is a separate question.
Well, let me just ask a final question in this segment, and we'll come back and wrap up the interview, and I'll give you a few minutes to just sort of sum up your thoughts. I wanted to just end this segment asking about something related to what I would guess I'd call the limits of knowledge that we have, and I think you've pretty much given a good accounting that certainly we are mortal, finite, limited beings, human consciousness. So let me ask: do you think that, given the complex nature of what we can call the cosmos or the universe, that consciousness is, in a sense, almost inevitable at some point? So, if we were to get, for example, wiped out and 10, 50, 100 million years go by, would it be inevitable for consciousness to re-rise? Because as far as we know, we are the first intelligent species on the planet. Or is it just one of those things that just happened and damn, we were lucky?
I think as long as you have life, as long as there's some life, biological life, you will get consciousness. I agree with your latter point. No, it's not that we just got lucky. It's that ultimately consciousness has to arise given the laws of natural selection, which drive us towards ever more complex brains, and more complex brains sort of goes hand in hand with more consciousness. We also find ourselves in a universe that's conducive to the emergence of stable environments where you can have complex molecules that ultimately self-assembly and become conscious, and then they become conscious of ourselves. So this is called the anthropic principle. And so therefore, for reasons that I don't understand and I don't profess to understand, I find myself born into a universe that's conducive to life and also conducive to the emergence of consciousness, including self-consciousness, whether it's on our star, whether it's Homo sapiens or some other species, or whether it's on some other star. It's quite a wonderful thing. I don't know how it came about, but this is the universe I find myself living in. In fact, I find it gives rise to a great deal of sort of optimism and hope that we do live in such a beautiful, strange but beautiful universe that gives rise to conscious sensation and to the experience of this universe.
Well, let me just ask you, just as a follow-up, because you mentioned the anthropic principle. You're not arguing that there was causality, that we are the end result of a plan. You're just saying that circumstances arose by whatever means that facilitated that we could be conscious. You're not saying that there's a creator that said, "Oh, I'm creating humanity or consciousness in my image."
Certainly not that there was a plan to derive to create Homo sapiens sapiens. All I'm saying is, once again, for reasons I don't understand,
Okay.
I live in a universe that's conducive, that's remarkable conducive to life,
Yeah.
and also remarkable conducive to the emergence of consciousness, including self-consciousness, life reflecting upon itself.
Okay.
There are varieties of explanations. One is some sort of creator. The other one is, eternal inflation or multiverses. So people have come up with all sorts of explanations. Yeah. One strongly suspects that we'll never really know the answer to it, because all of these, if there are multiverses, by definition, they're outside our light cones. We can never causally interact with them, so we'll never know.
Yeah.
But I do find it very strange, and I find it very uplifting to live in such a place.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So we'll end this segment here, and in our final segment, I'll just give you a few minutes to just sort of wrap up your ideas on the nature of consciousness. I've been speaking on the nature of consciousness with Christof Koch, and I guess just before I give you just a couple of minutes to sum up any of your theses or ideas about it, I guess I would say one of the things that I always tell people is that there are some things in life or whatnot that are the answer is just because, that it seems to just be that there's no other way around it. And I guess from what I've gotten in the last hour or so of speaking with you is that for whatever reasons, complexity or the way the universe played out or the way quantum physics and the laws of the universe spread out, the consciousness seems to be just one of those things that is going to happen. Did I misread that, or would that be sort of a fair summing up of your take on that?
Well, you need something like evolution by natural selection. But yes, given that we live on a planet where you have, a stable environment for long, complex molecules to self-assembly and then to evolve, I think consciousness had to have happened in some way or shape or form. And then all you need is evolution to act long enough onto these mechanisms, onto these organisms, that they develop brains, and that the brains then develop enough complexity to be able to begin to reflect upon themselves. And then you get self-consciousness, you get creatures like us that can ponder, eternity, that can ponder what went on before they were around and what will happen after their life ends.
Well, let me just give you a final say on consciousness, and let me just ask: in your lifetime, if what is the big question that you would like to see answered about consciousness, the nature of consciousness in your lifetime? And
well, consciousness, the mind-body problem, as conceived by the ancient Greeks in Athens, sort of, it's one of the oldest philosophical problems around. We are now, over the last 50 years, we're beginning to see some real progress. We know it's the brain. We're now beginning to identify which bits and pieces of the brain are involved in consciousness. And most interestingly, and most rewarding, we now are beginning to have theories of consciousness that tells us which creatures are conscious, and that also seem to suggest that consciousness is much more widespread, is maybe in existence throughout the entire animal kingdom, which is why I'm now a vegetarian since many years, because I want to avoid eating sentient creatures. And it provides us a wonderful, reassuring view onto the rest of the world, that we are all nature's children. We are all capable of experiencing things. In my own lifetime, I hope to continue to be involved in some of this work toward furthering deciphering what specific mechanisms are involved in generating this thing we call experience, we call subjectivity.
Well, if you enjoyed this conversation, you can look below this video. I'll have a link to Christof's website, his homepage, and you can also find his work on Amazon and other stuff. So I just want to thank you for spending an hour or so with me talking about your life's work.
Thanks a lot. It's been very enjoyable, Dan.